Hi there guys, got a nice quick video here today on hammer spring guides. So what I want to do in this video is just show you what they're used for and how I make my ones. With that said, I'm going to be working on the Outgun Rapid in this particular video. However, the information in this video will be fairly universal, so it should apply to most airguns. Right then, so first of all, a hammer spring guide is a piece of material, typically plastic, used to guide the hammer spring as it's compressed and extended. A spring guide will typically run through the center of the spring and stop the tendency to bend or flex as it's compressed. The guide forces the spring to act in a linear motion and reduces the inconsistency as the spring is decompressed or expanded. This can result in a slightly lower feet per second spread over the chronograph, although typically they just help smooth things out a little. Another benefit of the spring guide is that they can also help quieten the action noise down, as the guide will act like a vibration dampener, and it will also take out some of the metal-to-metal contact between the pieces. With that said, there are three materials hammer spring guides are typically made from, and I have them laid out here. So on this end we have PTFE. This piece here is Delrin or Acetyl Pom H, and this piece here is PEEK. Each material has its various strengths and weaknesses and will be beneficial in certain circumstances. So on this end, PTFE or Teflon is the softest material but also the most slippery. PTFE is typically only used in sub 12 pound rifles, as the heavier hammer spring tension on high power rifles will actually deform the material and it can squish over time. With that said, it is my preferred material and I will use it in rifles in which I can. Next up we have Delrin, so this is the most common choice as it's harder than PTFE but still quite slippery. Delrin will be used on both sub 12 pound and high power rifles and will be the typical material used by most manufacturers. The last material we have here is PEEK. Now PEEK is the hardest material here and will only really be used on high power rifles with extremely heavy hammer springs. PEEK won't deform like Delrin or PTFE, and this is the better choice if you're worried about the spring damaging the hammer spring guide over time. Right then, lastly I'll show you how I make my hammer spring guides. So the first thing I do is check the spring for any burrs or rough edges. So we're looking particularly on the ends and in the very edge of the spring. Typically where the last coil has been cut and then ground flat, you'll find a burr on the inside edge. So what I typically do is just use a file and some sandpaper and remove that before I start work on the guides. Another thing I'll do is polish the very ends of the springs so they don't dig into the spring guide over time. This one is the factory edge and it looks pretty good, so I'm going to leave that as it is. With that said, we'll take the material over to the lathe and we'll get started on the guide. Right then, with our spring prepped, we can now get started on making the guide. I have just a piece of Delrin chucked up here in the lathe, and the first thing we need to do is turn the OD. Now what I'm going to be doing is making the spring guide a nice fit in the spring adjuster just here. So we're going to be turning the OD down to about 12.9 millimeters and test fitting it into this piece to make sure it's a good snug fit. Right then, with that done, we can now turn our attention to the shaft. Now the shaft needs to be a good fit on the inside of the spring, but not too tight, so it wants to be a nice sliding fit. Again, we're going to be turning the OD down and then using the spring as a tester, just taking small amounts of material off and then test fitting the spring back on the shaft. Now the actual length of the spring guide here will be determined by the spring. What I typically do is fully compress the spring and measure the overall length, and that will be the length that I use to make my spring guides. What this will do is allow me to set any hammer spring tension on the rifle and ensure that the guide won't bottom out in the inside of the spring. Right then, so that's the OD finished. The spring slides back and forward on the guide nicely. There's very little resistance there whatsoever. We can spin the spring and nothing binds, so I'm quite happy there. The next thing I'm going to do is just chamfer this end here, as well as part the piece off. Then I can flip it round and put it back in the lathe and turn the other side of the face. For now, I'm just going to be keeping the back edge here about 2mm thick, and then when I need to reset the power, I'll just use the spring adjuster to adjust accordingly. Right then, and that's pretty much job complete. The guide that you saw me make on camera is a nice fit within the spring, and the back of the guide is a snug fit within the hammer spring adjuster. I did also go ahead and make another guide for the other end of this spring to replace the standard washer that's fitted from the factory. So the new guide is pretty much the same thickness as the washer, it just has this little extrusion on the top, which again is a nice fit within the end of the spring. The only other thing that I'll mention before I let you go is that a tight hammer spring guide can cause inconsistencies. This is only really typically a problem on the sub 12 pound rifles, as we're dealing with much softer springs, but a tight guide can grab on the spring as it's extended and cause inconsistencies over the chronograph. However, I will say that in some rifles a tight hammer spring guide is used to remove the ring from the hammer spring as it's fired. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. But with that all said and done, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next one.